anytime a police department can get, equipment for the department, they're going to try to do that.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Bernie Kerik. He's the former commissioner of the City of New York, and you also were the interim minister of the Interior of Iraq in 2003, and you were a nominee for Department of Homeland Security when your career was rudely interrupted by a variety of things. In 2009, Kerik pled guilty to 8 felony tax and false statement charges and served time. And that's actually what we're talking about now is related to that is clemency. You're on a campaign to talk about clemency and sentencing reform. Why is that so important to you?
I think it's mostly important because I got to see things, personal observations of the U.S. criminal justice system that I was unaware of. Maybe I was unaware of it, maybe I didn't pay attention to it. I was naive in some ways. But given my background, 35 years in the business, I've run 2 of the largest law enforcement organizations in the country, the NYPD and New York City Correction, including overseeing Rikers Island for 6 years. I then went to prison and was a target of a federal investigation and realized that the U.S. criminal justice system has flaws and failures that I was unaware of.
So talk a little bit about that. I mean, you, in an interview with Al Jazeera, you said when you put someone in prison because he was a commercial fisherman who caught too many fish, or because someone enhanced their income in a mortgage application to buy their first home, you met those people in prison. So is the problem that we're bringing too many people into prison, or is it that the sentences are too harsh, or is it both?
It's both.
Yeah.
It's both. For one thing, you take a commercial fisherman that catches too many fish. Technically, it's a regulatory issue. Mm-hmm. It's, you can fine them, you can penalize them, you could suspend their license for a period of time. There's a number of things you can do to that person without destroying his life, his family, and his career endlessly. For the rest of their life, they are now a convicted felon. And I think that's the thing that people don't understand. They don't realize that a felony conviction technically is a life sentence.
Yeah. You're also critical of nonviolent drug offenders being put in prison. One of the things that a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans will say, it's a unicorn. There's no such thing as a nonviolent drug offender. You say you've met these people, people who are put in jail for first-time nonviolent drug offenders. 10 years for a kid who sells or buys or possesses 5 grams of cocaine. 5 grams is the weight of 3 sugar packets from Dunkin' Donuts. And you're putting a kid away for 10 years.
Or more.
Talk a little bit
or
about
more.
that. Yeah.
If say a kid is involved in a second or third party conspiracy, in other words, the federal government targets a major bad guy, and trickle down the line of accountability or responsibility, you get some kid that buys 5 grams, 10 grams in that conspiracy, and they target him as a part of the conspiracy. Well, he gets charged with the total weight of the conspiracy. He doesn't even know the target of the investigation. He has no idea who it is. Well, he now gets charged and convicted, takes a plea for 10 years, for 15 years. You put that kid in prison for 10 or 15 years, he gets no real rehabilitation. He has no real education. He has no discipline and respect. And the whole time he's in prison, he's gotten an education of institutionalization, stealing, fighting, conning, manipulating.
And there's no way in your mind that prison can be changed, once you go to prison, you're going to come out more of a criminal.
Well, that's what it does. It's institutionalization.
So how important is the drug war to the overall increase in the incarceration rate in the United States?
The drug wars, well, there's 2 issues behind the drug war. One, drugs kill people. On 2 fronts. They ingest them, they die, or the violence as a result of the drug war, which is probably more devastating. We have laws on the books that deal with those drugs, and it's illegal. So the cops have to go out there and do their job. I was a drug agent for years. I've lost friends, my colleagues that were killed as a result. My partner was shot. I've been involved in gun battles as a result. there are people that belong in prison, and some for long periods of time, and I put them there, and I have no problem with what I've done. But when you take a young man that has an addiction problem, or take a young man that possesses 5 grams and you put him in prison for 5 or 10, 15 years, that is not a benefit to society.
Do you think pot should be legal?
My personal opinion is, I'm not into it. I've never been into it. I don't agree with it. And because of my family history of addiction, not me personally, but my mother, my father, my sister, I'm against anything that would create.
But
more
you're recognizing that it's the black market status that actually drives.
No, I
of
understand
the
that.
violence,
I understand that. And listen, some people have said to me, pot's a victimless crime. In 2001, in May of 2001, there was a execution-style shooting of 5 people in an apartment above the Carnegie Deli in New York City. They were laid down on the floor. They were all shot behind the head, and 2 of them actually lived. It was over marijuana. It's not really a victimless crime.
Right. But that's, if alcohol was made illegal tomorrow, you'd have that same scenario playing out over liquor,
You would.
right? So
You would.
people generally on pot, or I would even argue on a lot of other drugs, it's not like they take the drug and they become hyperactive. It's the deal, right? The violence is what.
Right. And for me, I'm not into it. I leave that up to the legislators. As long as there's laws on the books, the cops are going to enforce them. The problem with with the marijuana stuff now, the legalization, make up your mind. You're going to legalize it, you're not going to legalize it. It's legal in some states, it's not legal in others, and regardless of what states it's legal in, the federal government has not legalized it. So it's a mixed message, and people are going to they're going to lose their freedoms, they're going to be arrested, they're going to be convicted, because they're under the interpretation they can possess it in one place when in reality the feds can come in and lock you up for it.
Who are the toughest people to convince about clemency or about sentencing reform? Is it law and order Republicans? Is it liberal Democrats? How do you go about actually starting that conversation?
From what I've seen so far, I think the law and order Republicans historically have been the guys that say, the men and women that say, lock them up and throw away the key. I don't think that they understand what that does to society. I don't think they understand the collateral consequence of that to society. I really don't think they understood the economic cost to society. And over the last 2 years, especially in the time that I've been home and talking about this, I think that stuff is coming more to light. When you have a state like Texas, for example, the law and order capital of America, now looking at sentencing reform and criminal justice reform and closing prisons, alternatives to incarceration, things like that, and they're putting together some very successful programs, well, then I think it's time for the rest of the country to look as well.
Can we talk a bit about the militarization of police? This is something that Reason has covered a lot over the past couple of decades, and certainly over the past 30 or 40 years, over the course of your career. Probably, your policing life went from not really dealing with SWAT teams to now it seems like every small town in America has some kind of armored vehicle. There are thousands of SWAT raids a year. How do you feel about the militarization of police, and is it causing problems like we're seeing in places like Ferguson, Missouri, or even in New York City with cases like Eric Garner?
Here's what's happened. We, especially as a result of 9/11, in the aftermath of 9/11, and in the realm of terrorism that we face today in this country, naturally the police departments have to have the ability to respond. I completely disagree with the militarization of all these smaller agencies. I live in a town in New Jersey, has maybe 35, 40 policemen, but there's 70 municipalities in my county where I live. There are municipal police departments of 10, 12 guys, or men and women. And they themselves, they want heavy weapons, they want armored vehicles, they want...
What is driving that desire by police departments to get kind of roided up? Is it is it TV? Is it free gear from the federal government?
Well, look, anytime a police department can get equipment for the department, they're going to try to do that. I don't have a problem with the department's training, enhanced training, specialized training. But when you create this militarization of all these smaller agencies, and they don't have the ability to communicate with each other, and they don't communicate with each other, and I've seen this in my own county, that's going to create a problem. Now, that being said, I am totally supportive of the larger agencies, having as much emergency special operations equipment, training, and resources that they need, because my son, for example, is a cop in Newark, New Jersey. He is on the Newark SWAT team, but these guys are activated 4, 5, 6 times a week. Newark is a bad town. There are places like that need that type of response. New York City, unfortunately, it's been the terror target of, Al-Qaeda and the radical Islam for the last 20 years. You need that capability. We need the capability, but in places where you have these smaller towns, it could be as hurtful as helpful.
Let's talk a little bit about New York. Under Rudy Giuliani, and it continued under Michael Bloomberg, and actually I guess it started under David Dinkins, there was a radical decline in crime, and violent crime in New York. Most of the supporters of Bloomberg and of Giuliani say it's community policing, or kind of broken windows theory. What explained the crime drop in New York, and also what explained the more broad-based violent crime decline throughout America in the 90s?
The crime decline started with Bill Bratton, who today is the police commissioner of New York City. Back in 1994, Rudy Giuliani appointed him in New York City as the police commissioner then. He created CompStat. And CompStat was an accountability process where, as a police commissioner, I would get to see the actual crime rates of the city on a daily basis. I didn't look at them quarterly. I didn't look at them biannually or annually. I looked at them every single day. When I got in my vehicle at 6 o'clock in the morning, I had a folder on the seat next to me that talked about all the crime stats through the prior night. If there's a crime spike, you know it immediately. You can deploy resources.
So the idea behind that is, there's a hot spot where suddenly, for whatever reason, there's a lot of criminal activity. You flood that zone with cops.
Immediately, with cops, with resources, with community relations, with go into the communities, interaction with the communities, and you address it immediately. It's instant. Doing that, you see an immediate reduction in crime.
And it's not just that crime goes elsewhere. It actually seems to minimize the amount of crime.
Well, you're staying on top of it. Yeah. You're staying on top of it, and it's active. It's real-time enforcement versus after the fact following trends.
What do you think explains in place cities like San Diego, for instance, had a steeper decline in crime than New York? It did not use kind of the community policing or the CompStat stuff. What do you think was going on in the 90s? Because through about the middle point of the 90s, every criminologist was predicting the rise of super predators, et cetera, and then pretty much everywhere across the country, crime rates just collapsed.
Well, you can't say. I mean, New York City, I have a pretty good idea of what we did because I was there, and what we did with regard to crime reduction in the city police department and in the city of New York, I did on Rikers Island. Right. The same kind of oversight.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because you, as the head of corrections, you oversaw a place like Rikers Island, which is infamous for violence among inmates.
It was, right.
And you oversaw a steep decline in the amount of criminal on criminal or inmate on inmate violence.
Right.
How did you do that?
One, the same exact method that the police department was monitoring crime, I started looking at violence in the system and addressing it daily, increasing our searches, holding the inmates accountable for criminal action. You can't, in a jail or prison, it can't be a haven for criminal activity. And to give you an example, one of my the most violent incidents I saw at Rikers, 2 inmates held another inmate down on the ground and carved LK, for Latin King, into his back with a chicken or a turkey bone. 180 stitches. When I asked what happened to the inmates that assaulted this kid, He was put in special housing. Was he charged with a crime? No. Why? Well, it's jail. That's what they do. No. You can't go into a prison facility or a jail facility and attempt to murder someone or cut them to pieces and think that that's okay. So I started charging the inmates with violent crimes, with possession of deadly weapons, the same thing they would be charged with on the outside. I also created an accountability system to monitor staff, assaults on inmates, interaction with inmates, that kind of
Now,
stuff.
what happened? The New York Times just had a report come out that, particularly under the last term of Bloomberg, this was long after you were involved in the New York PD, that actually the guards, a lot of negative interactions with inmates spiked up. What do you think was going on there?
Here's what happens. Whether it's a presidential administration, a state government, or a local government, new people come in to take over. They ignore the policies that worked. They create their own, and whatever happens, happens. The leadership and the accountability that was instilled when I turned over the department in 2000 completely went out the window. And as a result, there has been substantial increases in violence on Rikers. They have 10,000 less inmates today than I had. 10,000. Yet their violence is continually increasing. There were a number of corruption investigations as a result of internal things at Rikers. The accountability and leadership was shot, and I think that was demonstrated in the New York Times piece, and more importantly, over a 2.5-year investigation that the U.S. Attorney's Office conducted and put out a report.
What do you make of the current case that's super hot of abuse of power of police in New York, the chokehold death of Eric Garner? You've been critical of Al Sharpton and people like that who criticize the cops, but I mean, what does it say that you're putting a guy who's being charged with selling loose cigarettes in a chokehold? What has gone wrong with the system there?
Well, here's the problem, and I think this is what a lot of people don't understand. Whether the cops were arresting the guy for selling cigarettes or whether they were arresting him for mass murder, once you tell someone he's under arrest and he resists, you have to use whatever force necessary to effect that arrest. In this case, you have, from what I saw in the video, I think it was 3 guys trying to arrest this guy that weighed 380 pounds. Could it have been done differently? That's going to be for a grand jury to decide. The chokehold, is something that, in fact, I think it was Bill Bratton 20 years ago that basically said, you're going against the policy if you use it. The problem you have is when you're trying to take down somebody like that big, that strong, you put them in a submission hold. At some point in time, you cut off their airway, and it turns into a chokehold. Here's my issue with the whole thing. People shouldn't comment until the investigation's done. I try not to Monday morning quarterback anybody doing the job that I know that's done because I've done it. My fear in arresting somebody like a Garner, somebody that's bigger than me, somebody that could overpower me, is that they do overpower me and they get my gun. That's a fear every cop has, because if they get that gun, you're dead.
What is the best way, though? I mean, there's clearly among, not just in New York, and arguably less in New York than in other cities, there's real tension, particularly along racial lines of, black populations feel like they're being overrun by the police or they're being, occupied by the police. What's the best way to, kind of de-escalate that tension?
Has to be constant communication between the police administration and the community. I had probably some of the best community relations in the NYPD with the community. I was in the black community. I had great relationships with the black community. It's the police administrators have to realize this and understand it. The cops have to be fair and respectful to the community. It can be done. It's been done. Unfortunately, it's not done all over the country, and then you have problems.
What do you think about wearable cameras and things like that? I mean, dash cams have become, kind of routine.
I started the dash cams in New York in the highway units, and one of the first incidents where I got to prove to the union, who was adamantly against it, that it was to their benefit, was a woman made a sexual complaint against a New York City highway officer, was caught on camera. It was completely false, and the camera vindicated the cop.
Right.
So that
Which is
changed.
something like in 90% of instances with dash cams, it ends up supporting the police.
That's exactly right. Especially because nobody
Do you
knows they're
think
there.
having like a wearable camera, for instance, the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, part of the problem is that you've got a couple of witnesses who say this is an unarmed guy, an 18-year-old, who was shot while his hands were up in the air, versus police saying nothing. And,
Right.
I mean, would a wearable camera
Well,
at least
here's
give us
the
more
thing about the
information?
police saying nothing. Whatever happened is going to come out in an investigation, and from what I understand now, you have local, state, and federal authorities investigating. It will, whatever happens, it'll go public. The wearable cameras, personally, I think it hinders the relationship between a cop and a community. Because if I'm an aggressive cop, if I'm out there looking for bad guys in New York City, if you're a New York City cop and you have a really aggressive neighborhood that you have to work, I don't know if that's a benefit to community relations, because I'm not talking to anybody. I'm not saying nothing. I'm not going to have any interaction with anyone.
Why not?
Because anything you say is going to be interpreted by somebody that has no idea what you're talking about, by what you mean. If there's a way to activate a camera when you go into a combat situation or you go into a confrontational situation, there's a way to do that, maybe. But just picture this. I put a camera on you for 8 hours a day, and I'm going to listen to everything you say for 8 hours. It's going to be a matter of public record, because technically that's what's going to happen. Is that something you would want? Does it invade your personal privacy? Of course it does.
Talk a little bit about what it felt like. Your career was, just a kind of transcendent arc upwards, right up until the moment when you were nominated to be the second secretary of the Department of Homeland Security after Tom Ridge. That's when all of your problems started. What did it feel like to have, just that type of world start crumbling, underneath your feet?
There are no words to describe that. I had a 35-year career that was pretty much unparalleled. I had successes and achievements in law enforcement that nobody has matched in the country, especially with Rikers. And then to have the same government that I've fought for and nearly died for more times than I can count, target you, initially over my nanny, not paying tax on my children's nanny. And then,
Who was an undocumented immigrant.
right,
Yeah.
from Mexico. And
Did you know that she was undocumented?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And,
do you think that should be a crime?
Personally,
Yeah.
no. I mean, there are people in this country, really super, super hardworking people. This woman that worked for my wife and I, a loving, caring, treated my kids like they were her own. I'm horrified that it happened, but I loved her to death, and she's a good woman. And there are thousands out there that do this. I think there's got to be a way to fix that in this immigration stuff. Regardless, when your entire world is then scrutinized, and that's what happens when you become the target of an investigation like this. It goes from the nanny to my apartment renovations, and then to everything. Your business, your taxes, your anything and everything. You can't even imagine. Every phone call, anything you've ever done is now scrutinized for the past 10 years. It's overwhelming.
And I mean, obviously, they dug up more than enough to put you in jail. Do you think that would happen to anybody? I mean, to go back to your where we started, talking about clemency or talking about sentencing reform. Are we living in a world? One of Reason's contributors wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day, which basically said that everything has been criminalized to a point where we're all guilty of something.
Every high school student in America, before they graduate high school, should be forced to read Silverglade's book. Every high school student, because no one in America understands and knows that if you give me a stack of subpoenas the size of this pad and give me the power to scrutinize you as they did me, I promise you, you're going to prison. Anybody in this room, anybody on that street, anybody in America can go to prison if you give me subpoenas and give me the power to investigate. Anyone.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. That's on a happy ending. We've been talking with Bernie Kerik. He's the former commissioner of New York City, and he's the principal at the Kerik Group now. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you, sir.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.